welcome. My name is Andrea Davis, and I am the room host for the National Low Income Housing Coalition Table Talk. We are really excited because that you've joined us today, and Table Talks are a new addition to the conference this year, and they're meant for you to have peer exchange around particular topics. These are meant to be conversational and interactive, and we hope you have time to ask all of your questions. I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A for Courtney, and we'll do my best to see that we get everybody's questions answered. Just a few housekeeping items, just to remind you that all sessions are being recorded, and that when you're not asking a question, please remain muted. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Courtney Cooperman with the National Low Income Housing Coalition.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for choosing to attend this session today. I know there's a lot going on with this conference, so I'm really honored that you all chose to spend this part of your day with me. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, or NLIHC. And for those of you who aren't familiar, NLIHC is a policy, advocacy, and research organization based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to achieve racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes have quality homes that are affordable and accessible in communities of their choice. We produce research that quantifies the scale of the nation's affordable housing crisis. We educate the public and policymakers about our findings, and we mobilize people to reach out to their members of Congress about federal housing policy. Although we produce widely cited research and we interface directly with members of Congress, we're more than just a think tank or a lobbying organization because we have a network of thousands of members and partners who advocate for policy solutions that are grounded in the findings of our research. So that's where all of you come in, and that's where my role comes in too. Each of the housing advocacy organizers on our field team covers a set of 13 states where we build relationships, we try to learn what's happening at the state level, and of course, we engage our partners in federal advocacy. So I know this is a table talk. I don't want to spend too much time talking at you today, but I kind of have this structured in two parts. So I'll spend a few more minutes talking about some of our research that sheds light on the state of affordable housing in Montana. And I'll take some questions and ask you some questions. And then I'll do another little mini presentation about our current policy priorities and turn it over for more questions. So to get started with the research piece, a few weeks ago, we published the latest edition of the GAP report, which quantifies the shortage of affordable homes for low-income Americans. The latest GAP report finds that the US has an overall shortage of 7 million rental homes affordable and available to extremely low-income renters, who are those making at or below 30% of area median income. There is no state or major metropolitan area where there's sufficient affordable and available housing for the lowest income households. And I have on here the statistics for Montana. So in Montana, there are only 45 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low income renter households, and only 77 affordable and available homes for every 100 very low income renter households, which are those making at or below 50% of area median income. So that's an overall shortage of about 18,500 homes affordable and available to extremely low income renters. Another really important statistic to know here is that 83% of extremely low income Montana renters are cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. And I don't think I need to tell any of you why that's a huge problem. It puts everyone, just one financial shock, one health emergency, one missed paycheck away from being at risk of eviction and in worst cases, homelessness. NLIHC also produces another research report called Out of Reach that calculates the hourly housing wage that a renter must earn to afford a modest rental home in each community in the United States. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the report finds that there is no state, metropolitan area, or county in the US where a full-time worker earning the minimum wage can afford a modest two-bedroom rental home. Nationally, the housing wage for a two-bedroom apartment is $24.90. It's a little bit lower in Montana. It's $17.76. Just because it's lower than the national figure does not mean that that's at all acceptable. A full-time minimum wage worker would still need to work 81 hours per week in Montana to afford a modest two-bedroom rental home. And because our research shows that the shortage of affordable housing and cost burdens are most concentrated among the lowest income renters, that's where we focus our policy and advocacy work. So I'll pause there. Have we had any questions come in through the chat so far?
Yes, we have, Courtney. Folks are asking for links to the report, and
Yeah.
I was headed to the website to do that, so I can go ahead and drop those in the chat right now for the two reports.
Perfect. Great. Yeah, so there's links for the full reports, and there's also interactive websites for each of them, where you can dig a little bit deeper into the state-specific data too. Any other questions? Or if anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question, I think we're a small enough group that that can work. If not, then I'll flip it around and ask a question for all of you. And you can either put answers in the chat or unmute. So first question is, what's your first reaction to these statistics? Does it feel like these numbers align with your experiences in the housing space? You can go ahead and put some thoughts in the chat or come off mute, whatever you prefer. Lisa's saying it feels on point. Definitely matches.
I would say that I think it's on point, but I would also like to see the statistics for like what is the housing gap like for people with like permanent supportive housing vouchers, for example, because it's so disproportionate. Like, for example, in Missoula, we have, I think, a 0.4% vacancy rate, but that vacancy rate is so much smaller for our clients with vouchers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that our partners at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities have a lot of research about like the impact of vouchers specifically. So I could look into some of their research. They definitely find that when households have a voucher, a lot of these, it obviously does a lot to mitigate cost burdens. But the shortage of vouchers, which is something I'll get into a little bit later, is just a huge obstacle to the program being as effective as possible. Yeah, I'm definitely seeing a lot of sense that this aligns with what you're all experiencing and the work you're doing on the ground. Yeah, and I think, Paul, you hit on a really important point. There's a lot more money to be made by building more expensive homes. And again, we see, if you look back at the numbers, I went forward on the slides instead of backwards, so preview. If you look here at the numbers, then actually, once you get to median income, there's actually a little bit of a surplus. Or once you get to middle income, there's a little bit of a surplus in Montana. It does not mean there aren't problems at that level, of course, but it really shows that to some degree, the market is meeting the needs of middle income renters, but it's at that lower income end of the spectrum where the market is just absolutely failing, and that's why we need policy interventions. And yeah, Eileen, you raised a good point. This is the national figure is 36 affordable and available homes for every 100 ELI renter households, but again, 45 is still not acceptable. And this data is from it's 2021 data for our 2022 report. The data is a little bit weird because of COVID and like census responses being very underrepresentative of extremely low income renters, but it is the most recently available data. And there's more on the website that gets into like the technicalities of why this data is a little bit different and not directly comparable with other years. And Out of Reach is our 2021 report. The new one will come out next month. So the data is a little bit older there, but pretty much as up to date as we have so far. Great. And then I'll move over to my second question. In your view, what policy changes do we need to address the problems that these numbers reveal? Yeah, Jacob, I appreciate your comment on housing being a human right.
Nobody's sharing any policy ideas so far. No policy idea is a dumb idea. Here we
Yeah.
go. Julie Flynn's got one.
Yeah, incentives for more production of affordable homes, definitely. And I know Winnie mentioned vouchers before. That's a really big focus for us.
And Courtney, as far as like federal government investing in more vouchers.
Yeah, that's something we'll get into in a few minutes when I turn over to our policy priorities. But some of you probably already know that the federal government only funds enough vouchers for 1 in 4 households that qualifies to actually receive it. So that's a big problem. I see Adam asked a question about Airbnbs. Yeah, there's some research that shows that Airbnbs coming into a market have an impact on housing supply. I think it's still kind of a new area. And, the problem is so great that I don't know that, regulating Airbnbs has the potential to solve the whole thing. But we've seen a lot of communities. There were a whole bunch of ballot measures in Colorado last year, actually, where smaller mountain communities voted to cap the number of Airbnbs or put fees on them and then invest that money in affordable housing. So I think there's definitely a space for that. Yeah, policies that allow corporate entities to buy residential land. That's kind of a growing problem of like private equity investment and then having landlords that are kind of even more profit driven. Government subsidy, yeah. State level low income housing tax credit to increase supply, requiring landlords to rent to a certain number of low income families or voucher holders. Yeah, I would say making it easier for voucher holders to use their vouchers is huge. Something that we advocate for is banning source of income discrimination because federally there's actually no law against a landlord saying, I'm not going to rent to you because you have a voucher. And a bunch of states have dealt with, I don't know if Montana, I should know this. I don't know if Montana has.
Montana does not.
Okay.
Montana does,
Okay.
Montana does not have that protection in place.
Yeah, lack of funding for organizations, incentivizing inclusion, totally. Banning source of income, I read at the same time as Adrian put that in there. Exactly. Yeah, making vouchers easier to use because some landlords don't want to work with the state or the government. Yeah, a lot of really great ideas in here. And I think that brings us to a good transition to the second half of my presentation, which will be a bit more about the policy priorities we're focusing on right now. So I know that a lot of the conference is really focused on what's happening at the state level. And for a long time, housing has really been seen as a problem for local or state governments to solve. And even today, sometimes we'll hear that advocates speak with their members of Congress and their members say, oh, well, we care, we care that there's a housing shortage in the community, but really that's something for the state, really that's something for the city, that's not up to the federal government. But I don't think I need to convince any of you that the scale of the problem is so large that it really demands federal resources. So I'm going to spend a few minutes giving a little bit of a snapshot about the advocacy we're doing right now. I could very easily take up an entire half hour talking about all of our policy priorities. So this will be a very abridged version. So for the entire time I've been at NLIHC, which is since August, and months before that, we've been pushing for the legislation formerly known as the Build Back Better Act. In November 2021, the House of Representatives passed the Build Back Better Act, which included $100 billion for NLIHC's top priority resources that are geared towards the lowest income renters. and that would be vouchers, the National Housing Trust Fund, and public housing. There are a lot of really great housing provisions in there, but we really focused in on those three because they're the most deeply targeted to extremely low income renters. Democrats are using a process in the Senate known as reconciliation to move this bill forward, which allows them to overcome the filibuster and pass the bill with a simple majority. But there's a 50-50 split in the Senate, meaning that Democrats can't afford to lose a single vote to get this package passed. And you may have heard the name Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. He has been really the sole obstacle at this point to getting this done because he opposes the bill in the form that it was passed in the House. So there's been a lot of negotiations going on between Senator Manchin, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and the White House, working to come to a new agreement for a new reconciliation bill, basically as soon as possible. If they don't get something done by the August recess, then it's pretty unlikely that they'll get something across the finish line before the midterm elections. Whatever Manchin will agree to, if anything at all, will be significantly scaled down from what the House of Representatives passed. He's actually expressed opposition, according to Representative Maxine Waters, who's been a real leader and chair of the House Financial Services Committee. She's really pushed him on including housing, and he's expressed opposition to it. Even though he says one of his top priorities for the package is to fight inflation, and cutting housing costs is really key to getting inflation under control. So you might feel like, okay, well, it's kind of a bummer that this senator from West Virginia is holding up this once in a generation opportunity to make transformative investments in affordable housing, but that's out of our hands. We're not in West Virginia. And that is actually not the case. As Montanans, you actually have a very critical voice in this process because Senator John Tester is both a member of the Senate Banking Committee, which has jurisdiction over housing, and he's a trusted moderate voice who has Senator Manchin's ear. So I'd really encourage all of you, if you haven't already, or even if you have already, to reach out to Senator Tester's office and encourage him to prioritize housing in his conversations with Senator Manchin and Majority Leader Schumer about the bill's contents. We know that he is supportive in general of our housing priorities, but he's also supportive of a lot of other priorities in the bill. So we really want him to be elevating housing to the extent that he can when he's talking to his colleagues, especially Senator Manchin, about the bill. And of course, members of Congress really care about how a bill will impact their constituents because that's who votes them into or out of office. So we have some research on what the impact on Montana would be. So if the House passed Build Back Better bill or enacted, Montana would receive an estimated $35.2 million in National Housing Trust Fund dollars. And the bill would also fund housing choice vouchers to serve an additional 800 Montana families. So of course, that's not enough to meet the full need, but it would be the biggest expansion of vouchers in the program's history. So I could spend a lot more time digging into our policy priorities, but I'd rather spend the last 10 minutes opening it up to more conversation. So I'll just mention that we're also involved in advocating for the maximum possible resources for housing and community development programs in the annual appropriations process and for bipartisan bills. There's one called the Eviction Crisis Act, which would create a permanent emergency stabilization fund along the lines of the pandemic emergency rental assistance programs, but its lifespan would be permanent. So to learn more about our ongoing policy priorities, I'd recommend attending our biweekly national calls, subscribing to our weekly memo to members of partners, and visiting our Legislative Action Center, where you'll also find links to reach out directly to your members of Congress about these bills. So I guess right now I can take any questions that you have about our policy work, and then if we have time, I'll turn it over to ask a question to all of you. So I'm seeing a few more ideas that have come through. Converting empty buildings into affordable housing, definitely. having the government build homes and transfer them to the private market. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the programs we care about do have that sort of public-private partnership, like vouchers. Um, More flexible use of ARPA funding. Yeah, that's a big one. And there's a bill that I know Andrea and I have talked about, the Lifeline Act, that would make it easier to use ARPA funding, which is like state, for anyone who isn't kind of in the loop on this, it's state and local recovery funds that came from the American Rescue Plan Act. And there's a bit of a barrier to using that as gap financing for LIHTC because all of the money needs to be expended by 2026. There's a bill that would kind of fix that issue. Getting it to move forward is a bit of a challenge because there's just so much on Congress's plate, and getting floor time for a bill is hard, but it does have bipartisan support. So that would be, we're hoping that works out. Not just hoping, also, actively advocating for it. That's what we do. But yeah, I can share a link to a little explainer of that bill that we have. We also newly have a database of how states and large municipalities are spending state and local fiscal recovery funds for housing. So I'd definitely recommend checking that out as a more research about ARPA. Yeah, so supplying more vouchers might not be the most effective right now in Montana. Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely a lot of regional variation and like where vouchers are most needed versus where supply is the problem. And I think that's why we're not advocating for vouchers alone or supply alone. We really see all of these parts as tied together. Other members of Congress that are engaged in our efforts. Yeah, so we have a really strong set of housing champions. I mentioned Representative Maxine Waters, who's the chair of House Financial Services. She's a really, really strong ally. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has been an ally, especially on public housing, because that's such an important issue for New York. Who else has been an ally? Representative Richie Torres in New York has been a real ally. We awarded him for his efforts to keep housing in Build Back Better. But really, there's a lot of them. If you register for our national calls, every few weeks we'll have a member of Congress speak on the call because they're not there to, basically they're there to like build enthusiasm for what they already support and what we already support. Like they're fully on board and they're giving us the momentum to keep reaching out to our own members. So there's really a lot of members of Congress that are behind us right now, which is really great. Current policy ideas to incentivize landlords to use vouchers or other forms of subsidies. I know there's a bipartisan bill that has landlord incentives. I'm totally blanking on what it's called, but I can get that for you afterwards. I know there's also, I spoke with someone in California that has, they do a landlord gold star program in their county. So they will kind of have partnerships with landlords and they will kind of help landlords meet the more complex needs that can come with housing extremely low income renters or people transitioning out of homelessness. So they'll basically provide some funding to those landlords in exchange for the landlords like agreeing to take renters from their program. Yeah, exactly. Like kind of incentivizing landlords to sign a lease with a voucher holder. There's definitely smaller scale programs happening to do that, and it'd be great to see that scaled up. Exactly. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of these ideas, a lot of ideas coming in. Awesome. Cool. It's a lot, really exciting that you're all kind of thinking about some of the same things that we're working on at the federal level. Does anyone want to come off mute and ask a question that you haven't had the chance to put in the chat?
Courtney, I have a question for
Yeah.
you. I'm trying to remember if it's from the National Low Income Housing Coalition or another group that has basically a state listing of state laws and status of those laws that are, to help with more home affordability. Are you aware of that? Is that something that you would be able to share with us?
Yeah, we have a tenant protections database that we launched recently. I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking of or if it's something else. And we have this like really brand new database about state uses of housing for ARPA funding uses for housing. I'm not sure that you might be thinking of something different, but those are ones that we currently have. We also have an ERA tracker with all the state emergency rental assistance programs. Adrian asked, I'm aware of any federal efforts to increase the amount of federal LIHTC available to low population states. Yeah, there are. There's a LIHTC expansion provision in Build Back Better. That hasn't been our top priority just because we've been zooming in on public housing, rental assistance, and National Housing Trust Fund. But it's been a big priority for a lot of our partners and definitely something that we support. So if there are no more questions from all of you, I want to turn it around and ask the group one more question, which is, have you participated in federal advocacy? If so, what was that experience like? And if not, or if you're looking to do more, what support and resources do you need to take part in federal advocacy? Because ultimately, our team, we can do a lot, but our strength really comes from everyone out across the country, reaching out to their members of Congress and sharing how all of the policies we've talked about today would really benefit them and their communities.
Courtney, this is Julie Flynn. I work with the for the Department of Commerce, and as a recipient of HUD funds, home and the Housing Trust Fund and Community Development Block Grant, we work through our national organizations similar to you, the National Council of State Housing Agencies and COSCA, which I'm not going to be able to remember what that stands for, but I'm sure you work closely with them as well. And like your organization, they're great advocates for trying to make our programs more robust in funding and more streamlined as statute allows. So I'm always grateful for the great work that organizations like yours do on our behalf. Thanks.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Our goal is really just to make it as easy as possible for people who are so busy with their local and state work to hop in and take part in federal advocacy without needing to be the expert on every single thing, but having a network to hop into. So glad that that's been something valuable for you.
Courtney, this is Andrea, and I'll just speak from Homework's perspective. First of all, I would like to reiterate what Julie just shared and what you just said, Courtney. The National Low Income Housing Coalition is an excellent set of resources, and it's been a go-to for us. We produce some educational materials that help break down the myths of the reality with somebody that is earning moderate wages. And sometimes there's a myth out there that people are making poor choices because they can't afford their home. And we've put together basically a budget that helps people recognize the real costs of living and forces them to make a choice. So we'll say, okay, this is the balance of your funds at the end of the month. What are you going to spend them on? Are you going to spend them on savings? Are you going to spend them on a child? Are you going to spend them on an animal? Are you going to spend them on paying student loan debt? On and on. And we use the National Low Income Housing Out of Reach report for that worksheet that we use, which is really helpful. And I would just share that our experience with advocating with our federal elected officials is really good once we get into a conversation with the staff members, that we can talk about the details of the issue and or the proposal that we might be advocating for. We find that there's really generally a lot of interest, and to really take our time to break that information down in a understandable format, because the work we do is relatively complex, and these folks, whether they're field representatives or other staff members, they're dealing with a number of issues outside of just our industry. And so it's helpful to be able to really help folks understand what the program is, why it's needed. And then, unfortunately, a lot of this seems to fall on party lines with where we are with federal deficit. So but tying it back to the realities of economic growth and economic development seems to certainly help just unilaterally across the board.
Yeah, no, we've so appreciated all of your partnership, and we're so grateful for Homeward and the way that you've elevated our research in Montana and are using it in your own community. So thank you for everything you're doing. I see that we're at time. This really flew by. Yes, home's a bipartisan issue, absolutely. But I guess we're gonna close out now. I'll just say that NLIHC is a membership organization. You don't need to be a member to be involved. But if you're interested in becoming a member, you can visit nlihc.org/membership. Or feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm always looking to make more connections and get to know more advocates. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you for all your great work, Courtney. Really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for attending today. See you a little bit later. People are hopping off. Courtney's contact information's in the chat if anybody wants to get a hold of her for any questions. All right. Well, look forward to seeing you later on probably the last session.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Really nice to have you here. Thank you for being a wealth of resources and information. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all the good work you're doing.
No problem.
All right. I'll catch you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.